In this video, I'll walk you through getting an Azure Quickstart ARM template that's not deployable to Azure Government, edited and deployable, including highlighting some of the common areas which cause an ARM template not to be deployable to Azure Government. In part 1, I focused more on the process of using GitHub. However, the ARM template we tested worked as is. Really all we had to do was change the README and the metadata file in order to submit a pull request. This time I've chosen a more complicated ARM template that allows me to highlight some of the common causes of existing ARM templates not working. So as this template reads, it creates 1 or 2 Windows Server 2012 R2 VMs with IIS configured using PowerShell DSC. It also installs 1 SQL Server 2014 Standard Edition VM, a VNet with 2 subnets, an NSG, a load balancer, natting, and probing rules. I've already done all the prep work I walked you through in the part 1 video. So in this case, we're just going to try to deploy this to Azure Government. And again, as in video 1, I'm just going to change this to .us. So we'll create a new resource group. I'll call this the same name as the folder on GitHub with a -test. Give it a username and password. I want to test out 2 VMs. And let's go ahead and click agree and purchase. Let's click on the deployment here. And again, in the interest of time and the magic of video editing, I'm going to splice out the time it takes for our first error to occur. Alright, so we got our first failure. Let's go ahead and scroll down. First, we'll see that a lot of things succeeded, but our virtual machines are failing. So let's take a look at one of these. And the first thing we see is the blob URL's domain must be blob.core.usgovcloudapi.net. This is by far the most common reason existing ARM templates fail in Azure Government. So if we go back to the Quickstart templates and look at the contribution guide, click on the best practices here, you'll see a section that explains do not hardcode the namespace for your storage accounts. And this basically gives you an example of the format you should use for your storage accounts instead of hardcoding. Alright, so I'm going to go over to Visual Studio Code. I've already created a new branch over here. The first thing I'm going to do is look for blob dot. Okay, so I need to replace this one. Oops, blob dot. I've got 2 instances. Or 2 occurrences. I need to replace this one and this one. The SQL Server and the web server. So blob.core.windows.net won't work in Azure Government. It also won't work in Azure China or Azure Germany, or it only works in the public Azure cloud. So we need to change this from being hard-coded to being referenced, so that it'll work not only in Azure Government, but other sovereign clouds. And as you can see, instead of hard-coding, we're now referring to the storage account. And then we're calling primary endpoints.blob. And then we're using the same VHD container, same variables, same call to copy index, etc. So we need to delete the hard-coded. Let's find the next one. Alright, and this time, doing the same thing. In this case, we're doing the SQL Server, so we're not creating multiple VHDs, therefore we don't need to do that copy index. Alright, so we've just fixed the storage accounts, so you can now push these changes to your GitHub repo and then point the portal to your GitHub repo. I'm not going to do that just yet because it's easy enough to copy and paste this right now because it's a single template. I will show you later how you can push to your repo and even reference other ARM templates, etc. from your repo. So I'm going to go back to the portal. I'm going to redeploy. I'll edit the template. Save it. And we'll use the one we just created. Everything else should be the same except I have to put the password back in. Click agree. All right, let's go take a look. Now this should go faster because most of those resources are already created, so it should get itself back to the point where it's just trying to do the virtual machines again. All right, so there's a bunch of stuff already. I click refresh. There we go. All right, so the web server is still going. So let's take a look at the SQL Server. So this is another example of something that you'll often have to address. The platform image is not available. And if you actually look at this and then you go refer to, for example, the Azure government documentation, and I think it's in the services section here under compute. No, it's in the images section under reference. You'll see a list of images that are available. And you can also check this through PowerShell. What you need to do is validate that the VM image that you have is available. So we'll go back to this error here and just find this string in our ARM template. All right, so there it is. The first image that Azure Government published for this is the SP2 image. So now again, I can copy this, come back over, let's cancel this. Let's come up here and create a new template deployment. Again, there are different ways to do this, but I wanted to show that you can deploy a custom template from the portal. It's one of the things I find that people aren't familiar with. So I'll come in here, Control A, Control V, save it, use existing. All right, let's check out the deployment this time. We see that a bunch of stuff is already there and validated. I refresh again. Web server 0 and 1 have been created, but now the PowerShell DSC extension is running. Now you may have picked up on the fact that I'm deploying this template manually, and it's referring to a PowerShell DSC zip file that's actually in the official GitHub repo. So for example, if I needed to change this PowerShell DSC zip file, I wouldn't really be testing all of my changes. So let's talk about how we can address that. So if we go back to the best practices and we look for something called _artifacts location, basically what this describes is that sometimes you want to refer to things that aren't part of the starting ARM template. That may be a PowerShell DSC zip file, that may be a template that calls another template, etc. And so the standards for this repo is to define an artifacts location parameter. And then by doing so, if you're pushing to your own repo, you can change the artifacts location as the value of the parameter and test everything from your repo. Let's go make that change. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's come up to the top. All right, let's clean this up a little bit. And then we have to use artifacts location. So let's go down and find our variable that uses DSC, which is right here. All right, so instead of hard coding this entire URL, we're going to replace it with concatenation of the parameters value plus the relative location of that PowerShell DSC script file. And again, this is the same approach you would want to use if you were referencing other ARM templates as subtemplates and essentially anything else that is located somewhere else, where you don't want to test from the official repo, but you want to test from your own repo. So in this case, I want to commit. So we'll just say updated to work with Azure Government. And now I can go ahead and push this to my repo, and I want to push it to the origin, which is the fork of the Azure Quickstart's repo. Let's go ahead and change the README as well. Let's grab this. And let's change that to US. And then we'll change this to Azure Gov.png. Let's just preview that. Yep, there we go. There's deploy to Azure Gov. And we'll commit these changes. Added deploy to Azure Gov. Button. Let's push that. So one of the steps I left out was the addition of the artifacts location SAS token. And unfortunately, when going back and editing this video, there really wasn't a perfect spot to insert this explanation without things feeling a little disjointed. But artifacts location SAS token is a requirement when you're using artifacts location. And so the documentation here explains why that is. And basically it's because these scripts can be deployed in multiple ways. And one of the ways is to deploy the artifacts to a private storage account. This is pretty common, especially when you just download these scripts. You make some of your own modifications and then you deploy them using something like PowerShell, for example. So I left out artifacts location SAS token. So what you need to do is you basically need to come in, add that parameter, and then concatenate or append the artifacts location SAS token to the end of the actual URI that you're building, so the deployment can actually access that file. So if you go over here to my code, you'll see that I've added the artifacts location SAS token. And then down here in the variables, I'm using a concat call. I'm appending the artifacts location SAS token to the string. All right, so another thing that I forgot to call out in the video that I'll highlight real quick is the virtual machine size. Notice here that this template is using allowed values, which means that only these values will be allowed when using the template, and when you're using the portal UI, you're going to be forced to select from a drop-down list. So one of the things you want to do is look at the virtual machine sizes. Come over to your favorite search engine and search for Azure regions. Select explore products per region. And then you need to look at whether those virtual machine sizes are actually available in your target regions. And so you really have two options here. You could either do lowest common denominator and try to find a set of virtual machines that are available everywhere, but that frankly is a bit limiting. And so my preferred option, which ends up being a little bit less user-friendly, meaning in the portal you don't get a drop-down list, and is a little bit more susceptible to errors, which I'll explain in a second, is to just remove allowed values. Right? And by doing so, now the template, at least in the portal, will have free-form text. Of course, if you don't use a correct value in that free-form text, your template will fail. And you can also do something like, something like this, right? Provide a default value to get people started, and they can always go look up the right values to deploy. And again, while this is, because it's a free-form text box now, it's susceptible to error. What it does is it ensures that as long as you're using a correct value in the region that you're deploying to, this template will work. Whereas if you use allowed values, you'd have to modify the actual template before you could actually use it. I'm not actually going to commit these changes, just again because this is something that I left out of the video, and if I were to commit this, the rest of the video would likely confuse you as you follow along. So I'll just undo these changes. So now if I refresh this, you'll see that everything successfully deployed. But again, this pulled the DSC file from the official repo, not my repo. We want to mimic the fact that maybe I changed the DSC file a little bit. So let's go to my repo, and we'll go github.com. Now you'll notice the changes aren't there because we're in the master branch. So let's switch to the branch we created. So I'm going to copy the link, paste it in, and first we need to replace Azure with my repo. And then second, we need to replace master right here with the name of the branch. Or you could have just copied this and pasted it into copied the content of the ARM template and pasted it in the portal. And once you get used to this and you trust that you don't have any typos, that's what I typically do. Alright, so now we have our artifacts location. And again, it's not in Azure, it's my repo, and it's not in master. It's got the same name as the folder. And we can use our existing. And so this time around, it's going, not only did it pull the template from my Git repo, it's going to use that artifacts location to pull the PowerShell DSC file from my GitHub repo. And again, although I didn't change it in this walkthrough, imagine that I did, or imagine that I'm referring to other JSON templates from my primary template, and I want to be able to test those as well from my repo before I submit the pull request. So if I come over here and look at the deployment, it's currently in the deploying state. And all this should go rather quickly since all of this stuff has already been provisioned. Alright, so this template deployment succeeded. And so now we're ready to submit our pull request. Before we do that, let's talk about a few other things that are common changes necessary in an ARM template. One of them is that the resource provider that you're using isn't available in Azure Government, or that the feature that you're trying to use isn't available in Azure Government. And so in that case, you will conclude that you can't modify your template to work in Azure Government because that resource provider and or feature is not available. Another error that you'll commonly get is using an API version that's not available. So for example, if you come over here and you do a Control F and say API version, if this version doesn't exist in Azure Government, then the ARM template's going to fail. So the best way to find out whether it's available in Azure Government, there are a number of ways. You can do it in PowerShell, but you can also do it in the portal here. So I'm going to go to Resources, go to Resource Explorer, and then under the providers, which you can also see which resource providers are available, let's say Compute, for example, and we'll select Virtual Machines. And you can see that the latest API version is 27.13.03.30, at least at the time of recording this video. And so you're going to want to go in and put the API version that will work in Azure Government. Now, if you put that API version in your template and the template still fails, and the error suggests that you're using an API that's not available in the version, then again, you've come to the conclusion that this template isn't able to deploy to Azure Government until Azure Government gets those new features. Another example is virtual machine extensions. Extensions themselves have versions. So similar to the API version, you're going to want to ensure that the extension version is available in Azure Government. And if not, drop down to the extension version that is in Azure Government. And if the extension succeeds and continues to work, then leave it there. And if not, and the errors suggest that you're using a feature of the extension that's not available, then again, you've concluded that you can't deploy this template to Azure Government. All right, let's go back to our code. And the final thing that we need to change here is, as always, the metadata.json. And in order for my pull request to succeed, we have to update the date updated value. So we'll change this to today's date. We'll commit this. Date updated. We'll go ahead and push this to my repo. So now everything's ready. Let's go ahead and submit a pull request. I will just click the Compare and Pull Request button. We're going to the Azure Quickstart templates, the master, from my fork using this branch. So what did I do here? I updated to work with Azure Government. Now I'll create my pull request. And just like before, click the check mark. This goes through the continuous integration builds. And again, you want to monitor this to make sure you've passed your continuous integration build. Then you have to sit and be patient and wait for your pull request to be reviewed and merged into the main branch. So in this video, I showed you how to make some modifications to an Azure Quickstart ARM template in order to get it working in Azure Government. I showed you some of the common changes necessary in Azure Quickstart ARM templates to achieve Azure Government compatibility.